Ronald Reagan was elected governor of California in November of 1966, perhaps the only successful mutiny against the political scriptwriters in recent times, it having been ordained that no forthright conservative could be elected to any important executive office, particularly not in the largest and reputedly the most progressive state in the Union. Governor Reagan is, of course, wedded to his ideals and sees no contradiction between a commitment to progress and a commitment to conservatism, and was apparently the least surprised of all Californians when he carried the state by a plurality of 1 million votes. He always believed in democracy, even in the movies. Governor Reagan's background is all-American, a Midwesterner, a college graduate, a sports announcer, Hollywood, Death Valley days, horse breeding, cattle ranches, television, union member, fraternity member, Friars Club, Lions Club, military service, American Legion, and then a sudden emergence as premier governor of the United States. There is much speculation on the subject of his future, speculation which I intend to avoid, because the purpose of this program is to ask whether it is possible to be a good governor. By that I mean this: are we now so dependent on the federal government that the individual state is left without the scope to make its own crucial decisions? I'd like to begin by asking you, Governor Reagan, this. Isn't the individual state, in the matter of taxation, required to make do with what amounts to the leftovers, it being the right of Congress freely exercised to tax directly what it wants, as it wants?
Oh, I think this is one of the great problems confronting the states today, and indeed endangering the very federal system of, the system of a federation of sovereign states. The federal government has preempted so much of the tax source. The state finds itself hard put to find sources without upsetting the economic balance that can keep our economy moving. And then in turn, the state, in its desperation for money, reduces the local community, where the real basic services that people must depend on every day are furnished. Education, the police protection, the maintenance of their streets, the sewerage, garbage disposal, all of these services. And your local communities are even more desperate than the states. So your states wind up taxing, and then by subvention, putting back a great proportion of the money that is taxed by the state of California goes directly back to the local communities. We go to Washington, and we are faced with this hat-in-hand prospect of asking for federal grants. And I know I'm accused of oversimplifying, but it doesn't make sense to me for the federal government to take that money first and insist that the only solution to our local problems is for them to take the money, and then they dispense it back to you in grants in which they tell you how to spend it from Washington, D.C. And of course, like an agent with a Hollywood actor, there's a certain carrying charge that's deducted in Washington before you get it back again. Here is a state that's one of the highest tax-paying states in the Union per capita. And we, at the same time, as a result of several years of careless management of our funds, we're in a desperate financial plight. California, in violation of its own constitution, is spending more than it takes in. And we've come to the day of reckoning. Now, we suddenly have to turn to the people of California and ask them for upwards of $1 billion in, I can't call it new taxes. We're getting along without new taxes. We're just raising the old ones about $1 billion. But at the same time, knowing the competitive position of California with other states in attempting to keep industry here, keep our people employed, competing commercially in our exports with other states that are in the same business or businesses, we have to be very careful that we don't make it uneconomic for business to operate in California. So we must present a tax bill with the sword hanging over us that Washington, which insists on controlling the economy through taxation, has its own ideas about some increased taxes to control inflation. So Washington is sitting there threatening an income tax increase And yet the income tax is one of the sources we must turn to. Now, how far can we go with that sword hanging up there before, when they let the sword fall, we find that we have just helped destroy ourselves?
Well, I think that's an extremely interesting dimension, the notion that you are, in effect, in continuing competition with the other 49 states of the Union for people, industry, and the rest of it. But in fact, don't the figures show that one of the problems of California, as one of the problems of Arizona and other very fast-growing states, is precisely that you have been too attractive over the years. 800,000 people per year come into California, raising, so far as I can understand it, at least towards the beginning, they are initial liabilities because it costs more to service them than they can contribute to the general kitty. So mightn't some of your neighbors say, well, you'd be a much better governor if you discouraged such an inordinate flow of people into this state?
Now, how do we discourage them, though? Because we have a nation that's based on the idea of the freedom of travel. What we try to do is have an economy, an industry that grows with that increase, because those people also mean an increasing market here. But we're an exporting state.
Do you have residence requirements here, for instance, in order to qualify for welfare?
Well, this was one of the issues in the campaign. We hope we still have residence requirements after that Connecticut decision a couple of weeks ago. But even so, they haven't been enforced strictly for the last several years. And there is a question in my mind as to the legality of those now. I made a charge during the campaign that when this state put into effect or implemented Article 19 in the Medicare program, medical care for the indigent, that we had forfeited our right to residency requirements. And I know that one of the oldest and ablest legal firms in this state is divided right down the middle as to whether I was right or wrong on that, and yet they themselves won't make a ruling. You see, by implementing this clause...
Dreadful breed lawyers, aren't they?
Yes. Yeah. But what they did was...
They're cautious.
Well, by taking the federal funds for the medical care of all of our welfare people, we're now getting federal funds. The federal government says to be eligible for federal funds, you can't have a residency requirement. These are paid for by all the country, and therefore anyone in the country has a right to have them. But
it is a legitimate means, isn't it, of trying to discourage thoughtless traffic among the states? I know that, for instance, in New York, a commission recommended to Governor Rockefeller a couple of years ago that he institute a residence requirement, incidentally a proposal that he did not proceed to accept. But their reasoning was that if you had a 1 year's residency requirement, people wouldn't leave places where they actually had houses over their roofs and jobs and so on and so forth, simply because of the allure of the Emerald City of New York, and then arrive there and immediately become public charges. But that isn't one of your problems in California?
Oh, yes. Yes, there's a very, I think, even a greater problem. I think this is true of any of the states, Florida, Arizona, California. I think when the wind begins to blow in Minnesota and Michigan, there are many people that if they are free to travel and not lose their welfare check, are going to decide that they would rather be on welfare in California or Florida, Arizona, than they would in those colder states.
Sure.
And we think that this has been one of our problems because California, with its great influx of people, continues to have a higher unemployment rate than the national average.
For that reason, presumably?
Well, I think there's reason to suspect that because at the same time, our welfare burden has been increasing here about 4 times as fast as the increase in population.
Well, Governor, let me ask you this, since a lot of people are extremely cynical about the whole notion of states' rights. It's been very widely contended, for instance, most recently by Senator Tidings of Maryland, that American conservatives like to talk about states' rights because there is still a certain glamour to the argument and a certain scientific exactitude to the whole notion of pluralism and federalism and so on. But that in point of fact, the states haven't historically acted in such a way as to provide the essential services of the people. His argument, and that of a great many others, is that if one were to remit to the states all of the money that is now going to the federal government that is being spent on social welfare, the chances are that the states would simply dissipate them, create more hot dog stands and more public squalor, in the phrase of Mr. Galbraith. Isn't it true that the states' revenues have risen since the Second World War far in excess of the increase in the GNP, an increase in the economy, and that this itself suggests that certain states were stimulated into doing their duty by the activity of the federal government? How do you handle a question of this nature?
Well, I think the people that make this, and this is always the argument, that, well, the only reason the federal government stepped in was because the states had failed in what they were doing. I challenge that argument, and I think it also ignores a very practical advantage in so-called states' rights. And the advantage is this, that if conditions are so terrible in one state, the federal system of 50 states gives the citizen the right to vote with his feet. As long as the rules and the regulations and the taxes are not uniform, there's a kind of built-in control on how bad a state government can get. Because if it passes a certain point, the people just pack up and move to another state where things are better. And this has been the historic pattern. We saw this a few years ago in Michigan before Governor Romney went into office under Governor Williams. Finally, the industrial picture had grown so bad that the automobile plants were doing all their expanding across state lines, many of them over into Ohio. And suddenly the people of Michigan did something about it. They realized that the economy of their state was going down the drain, and they took action. Now, this has historically happened, and I think that we should look very carefully on throwing away this control, because let's say that all of the rules become uniform, that Walter Reuther has his way and unemployment insurance becomes the same nationwide, and all the rules for disability insurance, all the rules for welfare, all of these things become a pattern nationwide. And then, if you object to the policies of government, where do you go?